really wonderful to be here and learn more about this community. So thanks very much, everyone. And Rigel, I think I'm going to share my screen here if that's
Yeah, go for it.
permissible. Excellent. I'm going to share that screen. I got to tell you, I love the way that you begin with music. That gives a nice energetic tone. Some of you perhaps didn't hear me when I just chimed in, but one of my favorite music quotes comes from Friedrich Nietzsche, who says, "Without music, life would be a mistake." And my second favorite quote comes from the late Roger Scruton, who says that music is the remedy to our metaphysical loneliness. And I thought that's a deeply suggestive and deep comment. So thanks very much. It is really great to be here. I've loved learning and reading Steve's work over the last few years, and you guys are doing great work in the developmentalist world. And I appreciate the opportunity to come and talk to you about a theme that really shouldn't be all that foreign to you, especially if you are familiar with the integral world, with Steve's work, certainly. If you're interested in process philosophy, excellent. And I would agree with much of Steve's comment about Whitehead, certainly. Although we're going to see from and hear from far more than just Whitehead today. So I titled the talk "The Cosmic Call of Value in 5 Propositions." So before I say something about the language of propositions, because I do mean something particular about that, let me just frame the discussion first. And I want to do so by asking 2 big questions. Now, I'm a philosopher, I'm a theologian. It sort of is my privilege and prerogative to ask big questions. This belongs to philosophy, absolutely. And I sometimes critique a lot of certain directions in modern philosophy that sort of shrink down from these big questions. I still think it's very important to raise these big questions, even if we cannot come to sure and certain answers to them. So let me raise 2 big questions for us. I hope they'll be familiar to you and they will frame kind of a backdrop to this discussion as it unfolds. So the first question I'd like you to consider is the question from Plotinus, the great Neoplatonic philosopher. And Plotinus asks, "But we, who are we?" A fundamental question. And I would suggest it's not just a question of identity, although that's a part of it. Rather, it's a question of connection. It's a question of coherence. It's a question of how it is that we fit into the cosmic landscape of things, this question of who we are. And the other question, perhaps even deeper, arguably, is the question of being. It is the question of Heidegger, the question of Leibniz, the question that has haunted, arguably, the philosophical tradition, namely, why is there something rather than nothing? So these 2 monumental questions, of course, there seems to be a relationship between them. One might argue that the way in which we answer one of them is going to implicate the way in which we answer the other. But they're important questions from a very high kind of philosophical or metaphysical, arguably, altitude. And I might suggest that the difficulties of our culture at present, the meaning crisis that we hear so much about, has many contours to it. But I think that part of it extends from this inability for us to offer any orienting answers when it comes to these fundamental questions. We have no orienting Weltanschauung, arguably, from which to approach these answers, or these questions, rather. But of course, in saying that, I'm not saying that there is absolutely dogmatic, clear, and certain answers to these questions. I would probably argue that it's more important that we keep these questions alive rather than offer any clear and distinct answers to them. Nevertheless, I do think that there are better and worse ways to approach answering these questions. And what I want to do with you all today is offer an answer, or at least an avenue of a set of answers in terms of value. That is to say, an axiological approach or orientation to these fundamental questions about who we are and why anything should exist. And what I'd like to do is offer 5 propositions that sort of lead us in this direction. So let me first say what I mean by the language of propositions. So Steve mentioned Alfred North Whitehead, which is timely. I follow Whitehead when I use this language of propositions. So Whitehead, of course, was a philosopher and mathematician. He knew quite a bit about propositions. And interestingly enough, one of the things he suggested with respect to propositions is that we do not think of them just as logical assertions. In other words, we shouldn't reduce propositions, say, to this verbal content of logical justification only. Or we could put it differently and say propositions are not just declarative statements of fact, either true or false. Now, they might include that, certainly, but for Whitehead at least, and for this presentation, there's more to our engagement with propositions. So Whitehead instead will speak about propositions as lures for feeling. So he'll use the language of propositional feelings as this way in which we feel our way into the content of propositions as kind of imaginative potentials for us, both individually and collectively. In fact, I like to think of propositions here for this presentation as simply invitations for your attention or invitations for your feeling. And for Whitehead, at least, when we entertain propositions, we're doing so with a kind of imaginative aesthetic interest or a kind of intrigue. So when I use the language of propositions, and we're going to see 5 of them, think of them in this sense, this lure for your attention, this invitation for both your interest and your intrigue. And the last thing I'll say by way of introduction is that I want to surround these propositions with a constellation, really, of key quotations, key figures that I've been studying, that I've been arguing with and wrestling with over the last several years. Now, these are figures you may or may not know. Some of them you may recognize, others may be new. But each of them, as we'll see, has something to add to this discussion and the aim of this discussion. Okay, so with that, let's move to our first proposition, the first lure for your attention, lure for your feeling. And the first proposition is the claim that the cosmos is not anthropomorphic. Rather, human beings are anthropocosmic. That is to say, we are an expression of this cosmos and not a deviation from it. And I rather like this language of anthropocosmic. In fact, I thought I had invented it for the last couple of months, but as is often the case, you find that somebody else got there before you. In this case, the Harvard Confucianist scholar Tu Wei-ming, who says, in this view, human beings are not merely creatures, but co-creators of the cosmic process. We must take responsibility, he says, for this anthropocosmic interplay. I love that language, this anthropocosmic interplay. But of course, Tu Wei-ming was not the only one. I turn, of course, to one of my favorite Russian existentialist philosophers, Nikolai Berdyaev, who says the knowledge of mankind or humankind rests upon the supposition that man is cosmic in his nature. Or the Jesuit priest Teilhard de Chardin, who will be familiar to most of you, the person, the human monad, he says, is like every monad, essentially cosmic. Or one of my favorites, the Spanish priest and philosopher Raymond Panikkar, says the human community is not limited to its fellow human creatures. The human community is also cosmic, since the human being is an integral and even constitutive part of the cosmos itself. So it's a rather ancient insight that we are an exemplification rather than an exception to this cosmos. And yet it's one that we see ignored, sometimes actively, in the development of modern philosophy and modern science. It's not uncommon to hear popular scientists speak as if though human beings were not part and parcel of this cosmos and whatever it is doing. So I'd like to demonstrate this with a playful tweet exchange from 2019. This comes from the astrophysicist Neil deGrasse Tyson, who will be familiar to most of you, and a brilliant response, I think, coming from the late comedian Norm Macdonald, who most of you also probably know. And this illustrates this sort of tension about the place of human beings in the world, this question of our anthropocosmic relationship to all that is. So I imagine it's about 6 a.m. deGrasse Tyson gets up, he has a pot of coffee, and he wants to give a message to his rather large following. And here it is. The universe is blind to our sorrows and indifferent to our pains. Have a nice day, right? It's a lovely way to begin a day. To which MacDonald, I think, brilliantly responds, Neil, there is a logic flaw in your little aphorism that seems quite telling. Since you and I are part of the universe, then we would also be indifferent and uncaring. Perhaps you forgot, Neil, that we are not superior to the universe, but merely a fraction of it. Nice day indeed. So it's a playful response, but there's something deep within it. So the logic flaw that Norm is pointing to is that Neil can only utter these statements by removing his own existence and experience out of the universe, as if though it had nothing to say about this universe, its nature, its character, and what it is up to. After all, if we think about our experience, we're hardly the kinds of creatures, say, that are blind to sorrow and indifferent by pain. In fact, at cultural and individual levels, most of us, if we are healthy, arguably, would see those as moral faults, wouldn't we? What is more, this refrain, "Have a nice day," itself is hardly blind or indifferent. So what Norm is pointing to, rather, is his neglect of this anthropocosmic interplay of which two-way Ming speaks. We cannot just abstract our own existence and experience out of the universe. So I think it's important for us to counter this tendency of abstraction, as Whitehead would call it, and affirm that we are part and parcel of this universe, and counter quick dismissals of our weddedness to nature that come through whether deGrasse Tyson or certainly a number of others. And I love this statement by Ian McGilchrist, who we recently had a conference in honor of his thought, but who counters precisely this kind of insight. It's as if he's responding to statements by deGrasse Tyson and those like him. So consider his thoughts. He says, there's a parallel between the false view that we are separate from and over against nature, and the idea that we are separate from and over against the cosmos. This cannot be true for the same reason in either case. We were born out of and returned to the one and the other. It therefore makes no sense, Neil, to set us up as proud, lonely, tragic figures, struggling against nature, trying to subdue her, or struggling defiantly to bring love, goodness, and beauty into a hostile cosmos. Any love, goodness, or beauty we can bring come out of nature and out of the cosmos in the first place. Where else can they possibly come from? Where indeed? So the central thrust then of this first lure for your attention or lure for your feeling is that our anthropocosmic experience speaks about the cosmos at large, and the cosmos at large also speaks in human experience. But what does it say? What does it speak? And for here now, we'll turn to the second proposition, the second imaginative lure for your attention. So the second proposition is that what the cosmos speaks or what it proclaims in human experience is value. And here I want to turn to Alfred North Whitehead and Max Scheler, the German existentialist and phenomenologist philosopher. So Whitehead says, our enjoyment of actuality is a realization of worth, good or bad. It is a value experience. Its basic expression is have a care. Here is something that matters. Yes, that is the best phrase. The primary glimmerings of consciousness reveals something that matters. So here is Whitehead's claim about the mattering of things. So for him, the universe is not made of vacuous, dead matter. It's more accurate to say it's made of what matters. It's made of meaning, and meaning that is presented to consciousness, meaning that is presented to experience. And Saylor has something similar in mind when he speaks about a pure value quality that is first given or proclaimed in our felt experience. And he draws this lovely analogy with colors. So just as colors, for example, are given in visual perception, so too are values given through a kind of valueception in the mode of feeling. And it's this valueception for him that precedes conception, that precedes perception in this kind of feeling form. We're going to return to that this analogy with color a couple times here in this talk. But consider it a bit further. If I were to show you on the screen here these two colors, we don't have to sit back and analytically deduce what colors we are looking at. Rather, these colors are announced to us. They're proclaimed to us through our visual perception. What is more, there's a kind of trans-temporal dimension, arguably, to color. The green on the screen is related in some way to the green of, say, an ancient reed in the river Nile Delta. As Whitehead states, a color is eternal. It haunts time like a spirit. It comes and goes, but where it comes, it is the same color. So we don't invent, arguably, these possibilities of color. We don't, what would we say? We don't project color onto the world, right? Color meets us in the form of a kind of proclamation, a kind of discovery, disclosure in our experience. And arguably, I would suggest we could say something similar about values to keep this analogy going. So again, I'll turn to McGilchrist, who I think is always insightful on these matters. He says the customary way to think of values is to see them as piggybacking on and arising out of our consciousness, a human invention. An alternative view is that values are not invented, but discovered and disclosed. And it takes life to discover and disclose them, that they declare themselves in and through the responses of living beings to the world and the world's responses to them. Okay. Again, we see the anthropocosmic dimension here as well. So the central thrust I would suggest for the second proposition is that the declaration of experience is value, that all value experience, is value experience, and that experience, in some deep sense, is the feeling of value. But that's not all we can say about value. So let's go a bit further into value. The third proposition. So the third proposition is the claim that where there is any value, there is an attendant spectrum or hierarchy of values. I'd like to return to Shaler here. So notice Shaler's statement. He says, in the totality of the realm of values, there exists a single ordering of ranks that all values possess among themselves. It is because of this that a value is higher or lower than another one. This order, he says, lies in the essence of values themselves, as does the difference between positive and negative values. It does not belong simply to values known by us. So here's Shaler's statement of a kind of objective ordering or hierarchy of values that is what it is, independent of what I, in particular, may think about. An objective ordering of values. And if you've read some of Max Shaler's work, he did quite a lot of work on value and ethics. He developed a rather insightful hierarchy of values, a pyramid of values, with a five-fold structure here. And at the base of it was values of utility and usefulness, moving up to sensual values or values of virtue, to wisdom values of truth, beauty, and goodness. And finally, the pinnacle of these transcendent kinds of value, values of the holy, values of the sacred. And again, arguably, I might suggest that the cultural tensions in which we find ourselves, the meaning crisis in which we find ourselves, is linked to arguably a kind of inversion of this hierarchy where values of utility and usefulness are prioritized or seen at the top, whereas wisdom values or transcendent values are seen to be at the bottom. And I might point you to the colors here again to draw that analogy forth. It's as if colors are or values are the colors of our feelings in this regard. And it seems to be the case that you can no more abstract a single color from the whole hierarchy or spectrum of colors of which it is a part than you can say a single value from arguably the qualitative hierarchy or spectrum of value of which it too is a part. Again, that analogy is a playful one. So for Shaler, this hierarchy is in some sense present in human experience, but it's in no way confined to human experience. So here we can turn to Whitehead's cosmological statements. One of my favorite statements, Whitehead says, on a grand scale, our cosmology discloses a process of overpowering change from nebula to stars, from stars to planets, from inorganic matter to life, from life to reason and moral responsibility. And what is going on here? This is rather a remarkable statement about what seems to be a kind of upward drive in the evolutionary process. And at least for Whitehead, what's occurring in that process are achievements of value, which then merge together and allow for deeper achievements of value up ahead. And at high evolutionary levels, the dawning of moral intuition, the dawning of moral responsibility. So in another statement, for example, he says the problem of evolution is the development of enduring harmonies, of enduring shapes of value, which merge into higher attainments of things beyond themselves. Aesthetic attainment, at least for Whitehead, is interwoven, he says, with this texture of realization or this texture of actualization. Now, for him at least, aesthetic value is the widest and most inclusive form of value that's applicable to the universe. And it's in this sense that his assistant for a time, Charles Hartshorne, states that the most general principles of harmony and intensity are more ultimate than the laws of physics and are the reasons for their being natural laws. So harmony and intensity are aesthetic concepts that are deeper than the laws of physics, precisely in some sense because they are embodied within them. So here Hartshorne again is drawing from Whitehead's deep aesthetic kind of interest. Whitehead says, for example, it's not the case that there is an actual world which accidentally happens to exhibit an order of nature. Rather, there is an actual world because there is an order of nature. All order is aesthetic order, and the moral order, he says, is merely certain aspects of the aesthetic order. Now, some have wanted to read this as Whitehead essentially subordinating the morality to aesthetics, but I think a deeper engagement with Whitehead shows rather the opposite. Rather, it's Whitehead's location of morality across an evolutionary spectrum of value. After all, there may be, we could say, epochs of our universe, say the development of protons and electrons that are expressive of intensity, of harmony, and of order, of aesthetic value. But it doesn't seem that moral value applies at that level, right? So it's a vision of the evolution and the eventual dawning of a kind of moral value and moral intuition, the antecedents of which are aesthetic in nature. So then, the thrust then of our third principle here is that human experience, as a part of both cosmological and biological evolution, presuppose what Hartshorne called this affective continuum, or this hierarchy of felt values. But I still think we can say something deeper about value. It's as if we're going deeper and deeper and deeper with each of these propositions, each of these lures for your attention. So what else can we say? Our fourth proposition is the claim that in the hierarchy of values, there is an asymmetrical relation among higher values which are inclusive and lower values which are exclusive. And here I turn to William James and as well a great comment by McGilchrist. So James is unbelievably insightful. Whitehead called him an adorable genius. So consider James' a rather reflective comment with respect to this proposition. He says, looking back on my own experiences, they all converge towards a kind of insight to which I cannot help ascribing some metaphysical significance. The keynote of it is invariably a reconciliation. It's as if the opposites of the world, whose contradictoriness and conflict make all our difficulties and troubles, were melded into unity. Not only do they, as contrasted species, belong to one and the same genus, but one of the species, the nobler and better one, is itself the genus, and so soaks up and absorbs its opposite into itself. So there's a lot there, but this is James's statement about a kind of asymmetry among opposites. And I think Ian McGilchrist states it brilliantly when he says this is a statement about the equal necessity, but also the unequal status of spiritual opposites in the universe. And so both men are haunted by, well, what we might call a kind of axiological asymmetry in the universe. And we should consider these as kind of koans from the Buddhist tradition. For example, isn't it the case that love can include hate without being diminished, but hate cannot include love without being extinguished? Isn't it the case, arguably, that, say, goodness can include evil without being diminished, but evil cannot include goodness without being extinguished? Perhaps harmony, we might say, can include discord without being diminished, but discord cannot include harmony without being extinguished. Or, to give another example, order, perhaps, we might say, can include chaos without being diminished, but chaos cannot include order without being extinguished. Now, of course, we can argue about all these, we can propose others. The point I'm making is this haunting sense of a kind of axiological asymmetry in the nature of things. As McGilchrist said, the equal necessity, but the unequal status in terms of inclusion and exclusion of spiritual values in the universe. But of course, it's not just arguably values or axiology which shows this asymmetry. As Louis Pasteur, I think, rightly puts it, the universe as a whole is asymmetrical. Life is dominated by the effects of asymmetrical forces whose enveloping cosmic existence we sense intuitively. I'd even say that living species are primordially, in their structure, in their external forms, functions of this cosmic asymmetry. So the thrust then of this fourth proposition is that we intuit value as a kind of cosmic asymmetrical force where they're tangled in terms of necessity, but they are asymmetrical in terms of their importance, in terms of their ability to include and to exclude. And I wonder, if we intuit value as this kind of cosmic asymmetrical force, wouldn't this give us grounds to begin speaking about the ground of being itself, or in some sense, say, the reason or the meaning of life itself, perhaps even for existence as such? I know that's provocative, but this is the direction we're going with our final proposition. So the final proposition, final lure for your attention, is that the reason or the meaning, say, of the world and life itself consists in its ability to respond to the proclamations of positive value which asymmetrically ground its being. Now, here we could turn to a number of different thinkers. I point you first to the striking statement from Thomas Nagel in his great book, Mind and Cosmos, which says, value is not just an accidental side effect of life. Rather, there is life because life is a necessary condition of value. So here is a statement by Nagel that value in some sense is deeper than life. We don't have value because of life. Rather, we have life because of value. Value is the deeper environment, the deeper category, arguably. Now, Philip Goff in the UK has argued along similar lines recently, saying that there are fundamental facts as basic as the laws of physics or, say, the axioms of mathematics about things that are better and worse, and arguably about how we ought to behave. And he calls these value facts. He's saying if there are any, they must be primitive facts in their own right. So what does it mean to say that they're primitive? Well, he's meaning in the philosophical sense. That is to say, they're necessary, they're eternal in nature, they're in the nature of things and not just arising out of nowhere. Now, I like Philip Goff's work, but Goff really is re-energizing some of the central work that's done by John Leslie, in particular what he calls his axiarchism. Leslie is a wonderful British-Canadian philosopher. And a part of his axiarchism, as he calls it, is the claim that necessarily, eternally, there can be ethical requirements for the existence of various things, or needs, he says, for them to exist. So for Leslie, the reason we have a world, the reason we have life and existence as such is because it satisfies an ethical need for it. And so if you were to ask him, why is it that we have a world? Why is it that we have existence as such? He'd say these things exist because it's good that they should, right? This final claim of value of axiology. Now, Whitehead, too, is involved with these other thinkers in a combined statement. He says all ultimate reasons are in terms of an aim at value. Life exists for its own sake as this intrinsic reaping of value, and that existence is the upholding of value intensity. So that existence is already an achievement of value, the antecedent standards of which are in the nature of things. So each of these statements lends us insight into thinking about value as being potentially a reasoning factor or the reason behind the existence of the world. But what about meaning? Well, here I'll turn to N.O. Lasky, another wonderful Russian philosopher, who says value is something which pervades everything. It determines the meaning of the world as a whole, as well as the meaning of every person, everything that exists, and even everything that may exist. So there's that domain of possibility, or in any way belongs to the composition of the world, is of such nature that it not only exists, but also contains within itself either the justification or the condemnation of its being, right? It's a statement about this value standard, this haunting sense of axiological asymmetry being embodied within us in some deep sense. Now, Whitehead, too, has something lovely to say here. In the context of this statement is a question that he received about the starting point of philosophy. Right? Where is it that philosophy should start? One might say mathematics, one might say theology. Whitehead thinks we should start with, again, aesthetic experience. And so this is the context of this statement. He says, our enjoyment of the values of human art or of natural beauty our horror at the obvious vulgarities and defacements which force themselves upon us, all of these modes of experience are sufficiently abstracted to be relatively obvious. And yet, he claims, evidently, they disclose the very meaning of things. So these standards, these possibilities of value, arguably, that are in the nature of things are not just human projections. And I'll draw to a close with a great statement by, again, McGilchrist to this effect. He says, it's not we who originate the possibility of truth or goodness or the beauty of the cosmos. Rather, he sees value as intrinsic to the universe and the possibility of appreciating and responding to value, therefore fulfilling its potential, as one reason for the cosmos to have evolved for life. And yet, arguably, in a Weltanschauung, which I think is shared by many of these thinkers, which holds that value in some sense is this ontological primitive, we might have grounds to say not only that value is one reason for the cosmos to have evolved for life, but perhaps the reason the cosmos has evolved for life. So the final thrust of this final proposition then is that the very reason and the meaning of things is value, right? That value becomes the compass through which we think about the reason and meaning of the world as such. So we've seen 5 propositions in the form of lures for your attention, lures for your feeling. 1, the cosmos is not anthropomorphic. Okay? Human beings are anthropocosmic. 2, what the cosmos proclaims or speaks in human experience is value. 3, where there is any value, there is an attendant spectrum or hierarchy of values. 4, in the hierarchy of values, there is an asymmetrical relation among higher values, which are inclusive, and lower values, which are exclusive. And finally, 5, that the reason or the meaning, say, of the world and life itself consists in its ability to respond to the proclamations of positive value, which asymmetrically ground its being. I think by way of conclusion, I'd like to offer a final challenge in terms of answering the call of value, this cosmic call of value. And the challenge is to move from a merely, say, propositional mode of knowing and feeling, as presented here, to a dispositional orientation towards the world. Can we develop what we might call a attitudinal axiology that would be transparent to, well, the transcendent values that arguably are realized within us, the haunting sense of value which points an arc over our lives in terms of meaning and purpose? And if we were able to do that, wouldn't that be a way of answering who it is we are and why it is that anything rather than nothing should exist? So thank you very much. Look forward to the discussion and the questions.
First up is David and then Mark. Go for it, David.
Great. Thanks, Rigel. We had some great conversation on group come up, initiated by Bill and Sally, inquiring deeper into the 4th proposition about the asymmetrical relation among some of the higher values, which are inclusive, and the lower ones are exclusive. We were wondering if you could sort of unpack that a little bit more. I think we had any number of questions, but rather than try to pick the best one, I would invite you to clarify from where you feel is the best place to start there.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, thanks, David. Yeah, and wonderful questions in our group too. Just kudos to everyone. You'll notice that I hope to not present these propositions as dogmatic, right? These aren't sort of mathematical in the sense that you add them up and here comes a proof. That there's something more visceral to them. So I think this claim about, in the 4th proposition, an axiological asymmetry is at that level too. I think of my own Christian tradition. Love almost fulfills itself, right? In fact, make maybe a stronger claim. The nature of love is to include its opposite, and in doing so, fulfill itself and not diminish itself, right? So there might be another way of expressing that, this sense of asymmetry that is inclusive. the equal necessity, because all values seem to come together. That was sort of the sort of playful analogy with color, that you can't just take one color, you take the whole spectrum with you. It's like you can't lift a portion of the tablecloth, everything comes with it. So it is the case that there seems to be a spectrum of value we presuppose, but that equal necessity, though, is not based in an unequal, is based in an unequal status as well. And I think the best of our spiritual traditions in some sense are pushing us towards this, right? And you might frame that in terms of, you know, pacifism or other types of movements, but that goodness can include evil, again, might fulfill itself and not diminish itself. So I admit to you, I struggle with that point, but there's something in it to me that seems quite right. So does that help? I mean, it may not give us too much to go forward on, but it seems that we're fulfilling, some values are fulfilled by inclusion rather than exclusion. I think love or goodness might be examples of that.
Cool. All right.
Thanks, David.
Mark and then Bit.
So David asked my question. So instead, I'm going to move to a second one, because this whole question of a hierarchy of values is really fascinating, and the asymmetry of them. I'm trying to sort of visualize a map of valuing here.
Yeah.
But the other thing that came to mind for me, I'm a psychotherapist, and I work with folks, some of them who have been, well, we've all been experienced some kind of trauma in our lives, but some so so damaging to their sense of their own worth that they feel like they don't matter. And that sense of not mattering is very hard. I think that's very much what you're talking about in terms of values. And the inability to know that I matter is such a disabling condition. And so this brings me back to what Carter was talking to us about a couple of months ago, in terms of the importance that we collectively go back and help those who are developmentally struggling. If we're going to create the world we want to live in, we really have to love into health those people who don't already know that they matter.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. Oh no, I think that's beautiful. It is a assumption of all this presentation, that human beings are an expression of value in the universe. We express order in a remarkable sense. So at least there's aesthetic value that's there. But there is a disconnect. You're right. And again, I point back to this meaning crisis, a disconnect between the values that we're so consumed with beyond us and the value that is expressed within us. And so I love that you're doing great work, I'm sure, but I've been reading up recently on what's called philosophical praxis or philosophical counseling, interesting movement that started in Europe. And it's about bringing the resources of philosophy, of dialogue, to the counselor and patient situation. And as I think about that with colleagues in Munich and beyond, this element of value becomes so fundamental. But people need to see that their value is not a disconnected island of value. And that's where this language of belonging for me becomes important. I said to our group, belonging is where being and longing unite. And I think to see ourselves as an expression of value, the standards of which are much wider than us, can be a way of reorienting our sense of belonging. And if I ever start a philosophical counseling practice, I think that's going to be important, an important part of it. So thanks, Mark. I love that.
Andrew, can you frame the meaning crisis? I think some people might know what that is, and some people may not.
Yeah. Well, the language of the meaning crisis is thrown around quite a bit. Of late, a lot of it goes back to the good work of John Vervaeke. So John's a friend. We had John at our recent Ian McGilchrist conference in San Francisco, and he has framed various contours of the meaning crisis. And of course, there's a lot of them. Belonging would be one of them, but certainly we could name a whole bunch. There's a crisis of value. And one of the things that he points to, which I think is right on, is the rediscovery through cognitive science, but through philosophy, of the modes of spiritual practice that always belong to the philosophical tradition. So we rightfully critique philosophy if it is just a bunch of dudes in an armchair throwing up lofty thoughts. When originally, through the work of Pierre Hadot, others, again, the philosophical praxis literature, philosophy was about a guide for life, a guide for living. And so I think Vervaeke's work is wonderful. The meaning crisis signals a whole panoply of struggles that we're facing as a culture, as a society, and at least in part the remedy would involve something like the rediscovery of praxis, the rediscovery of the spiritual dimensions that have always been a part of the philosophical and religious tradition. So that's just a word. There's much more on that. I'd encourage everyone to look at John Vervaeke's work if you haven't done so.
Yeah, thank you. Great. Bit and then AJ. Bit, you're muted. Can you unmute yourself?
Yes, I really appreciate the clarification about the value of philosophical midwifing. If you know Pierre Grimes, a great philosophical midwifer. Yeah. Yes, yes.
Right. Yeah.
Yes. So, the axial, I saw that you were coming in the axial tradition or from the axiological proponent in philosophy. I myself consider myself a philosopher to some extent. And one question I think I have is like whether the propositional nature of values. I see that this tradition goes back to Socrates, the Socratic form, which includes a dialogical approach to reality, which through Hegel, it's gone from Socrates to Hegel and to the modern and postmodern world. And I'm curious that what place this philosophy takes in a postmodern world, in a postmodern landscape, where there's no concept of hierarchical transcendence in the postmodern West, and also, yeah. So I like where the work is going, and I genuinely appreciate the adage or the Whiteheadian thrust of the presentation and the allurement of value, beauty, goodness. Yes, that is, and thank you. Yes, and so the beautiful, the good, the true. Thank you. And where is the and furthermore, like I want to ask you, where do you see beauty? Where do you see? I was just reading a philosophical book showing how Whitehead has certain limitations, and how there's certain limitations to Whitehead. In this book, they recommend we can restore reasons, we can restore rationality by in fact going into Aristotelian metaphysical thinking, which contains beauty, truth, and goodness in there in kind of a full bloom, so to speak. Like, so I'm wondering if Whitehead is the direction of the continued evolution of truth, beauty, and goodness also, and whether so because Whitehead tends to get bogged down in propositional
Andrew, to
yes
for your first question and then get
last 10 seconds if you don't mind, last 10 seconds. So Whitehead tends to get bogged down in propositional knowing, propositionality. So I'm wondering how it can move from propositionality to dialogos, and then through dialogos into the transcendence, the erotic thrust of beauty, which Plato originally in his dialogue in the Symposium was evincing the forward thrust of the erotic. Where does the erotic actually come in Whitehead? I hope that's a good question. There you go. That's fine. Yeah.
All right. It's layered, so I'll try to give a brief answer to it. To your last point first, Eros is there in Whitehead at the very core. If you look at Adventures of Ideas, another synonym for God is the Eros of the universe, right? And where else does he get this but deep, deep into the tradition? Let me jump to the first comment, though, about the dialogical nature of reality. I love your framing of that. I'm trying to hint at that by saying that we are response able to value. We're able to respond, right? It's and even this sense of the cosmic call of value, right? That there's this call to us, but calls require a response. Calls require a response that's consistent with the call in some sense. So there's that dialogical framing. Now, where does value appear in the postmodern world? There's different framings of the postmodern world, certainly. One of the problems of deconstructive postmodern, largely inspired by French thinkers, forms of postmodernism is this axiological whole, arguably, right? So I think we do need to find and this is what Steve's work is doing, along with many others, is to find a mode of being postmodern or post-postmodern or metamodern, or as the process tradition would say, constructively postmodern, that preserves what was good in modernity and transcends what is, bad, arguably, in a more deconstructed form. I think that's possible, but it requires nuance, and it requires us paying attention to the presuppositions of our existence. So I hope that helps a little bit. Thanks, Brett.
Great. Michael, and then AJ, if we have time. Michael, we're right up near the end here, so try to get to your question, okay, bud?
Okay. Okay. I already had a chance to ask some questions, but still there is one more. So it's all great about these values and asymmetry of values and so on. But what about the undeniable fact that most people, most of the time, don't live up to their values and doing horrible things sometimes to each other or even to themselves. And even the whole idea of moral progress can be questionable. So how all this to reconcile all this?
Yeah, thanks, Michael. Another good question, I might add. Absolutely. I mean, there's nothing in what I've said here which means that the highest values get actualized every time. Partly because I think the universe is truly creative. I would speak of freedom as a metaphysical fact. Now, so there's freedom at play here. Possibilities of value enter our experience, but it is up to us to actualize those possibilities, to achieve those values for better or worse. Possibilities of goodness and possibilities of precisely the opposite of evil rise together in the evolutionary process. And you cannot have one without the other. So we can appreciate the beauty, the moral beauty of somebody like Gandhi or King or Jesus. But coming with that necessarily is the possibility of someone like Hitler, Pol Pot, Mao. So like values are tangled, possibilities are tangled, and it is up to us. This is that responsibility that I think some of us were raising in the first comment of our session. The responsibility that goes all the way down in nature. Nobody's going to actualize the highest values for us. This is a part of the value of creative freedom. So we're still in a context of value from my perspective. That's a short answer, Michael, but I think it gestures in a certain direction.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
I love the way you say responsibility. That is on point. All right, AJ and then Steve.
Thank you, Andrew, for the presentation. This was very interesting. I will admit I don't have anywhere near the command of some of these philosophical principles that say Bit clearly has. We were in the same group and he was helping me understand some of this. I wondered, though, if we could return to the concept of the asymmetry, the asymmetry between values like good and evil, for example. And I wonder if we could break it down into sort of a practical expression, just to help me sort of intellectually absorb what we're trying to talk about there. So, like, for example, I don't mean to use the extreme or cliched example, but maybe like Hitler. I was thinking about Hitler having been one of you used him and Mao and others as examples. One of the evil, or at least someone who perpetuated great evil in the world. But also, we know that there was expressions of goodness and love in his life, like with his dog Blondie and with his wife Eva Braun. So is that an example you could maybe use to unpack this idea of good being able to coexist with evil, but evil being extinguished by good?
I think that might be one framework to speak about that. Certainly Hitler experienced goodness and probably enjoyed beauty and maybe produced art and enjoyed music. So there's definitely a coexistence. That seems undeniable. But I think from a higher level, this is the sort of philosopher in me, from a metaphysical level, when I think about the relationship between, say, good and evil, and for my purposes, I assume these things are a reality. The distinction between them. Again, one of the points I made in our group is that cultures, societies, political groups, we argue to the nth degree about what is good and evil, what is better and worse, but that there is a distinction between them. All of us inevitably assume. That's what we argue about. So, but from the highest metaphysical level, I'd say that it belongs to goodness to include the nature of evil. So here's an example. Imagine a Jewish person who lost their entire family in the Holocaust and was able to come and embrace and love and forgive Hitler. I know that's perhaps a hypothetical, right? But here's an example, perhaps, of what I'm trying to get at. And I realize it's difficult. So yes, there's a coexistence. That's what we argue about all the time. But from a higher level, I think there's an asymmetry that if we could orient ourselves to fulfill some values and disfigures others. Does that help a little bit? I mean, that's a great question, AJ. Yeah.
That does. Yes. Thank you very much for that.
Okay.
All right, Steve.
Okay, really, in our last 2 minutes, just, I'll try to make this as, I don't expect, you to answer, but let me just throw it out there. And that is, first, I really loved your presentation. I took a whole bunch of notes. I have a whole bunch of, questions, but the one that I'll ask here is just to observe that, like me, you're putting a hell of a lot of weight on the word value. Right. And indeed, what is value? Well, it's goodness, truth, beauty, love. But even those are sort of hard to pin down too. And I know that's part of the nature of value. This is not standing still. We can't just label it and say, that's it, there it is, like an object.
Right.
But I'm wondering if in the course of your your research, you've come across other conceptual labels that are at the same level of generality or abstractness as the word value. Like, Robert Pirsig, he called it dynamic quality, giving it a kind of a moving quality. And so my question is, an idea that I've been thinking about and at least kicking around, I'd love to get your input on it, is I've been thinking of value in terms of like trying to think a little bit like a physicist. Like, so there's time and it's got an arrow and we're moving in that direction, in the universe, we're moving in time, but we're also moving in evolution. And that's not it's making use of the arrow of time, but there's like something else going on, right? In other words, increasing complexity, increasing, value, increasing consciousness, all of the different labels that have been used to explain where evolution is going. Do you think that it's proper to begin thinking about value, especially in this hierarchical mode that you mentioned, as the trajectory of evolution, right? Where that is something is valuable when it's doing what the universe wants, and that is moving toward a more evolved state.
I like that a lot, Steve. Yeah. Boy, you should write about that, huh? I know you're doing that now.
Doing it, yeah.
I know you're writing a book. I look forward to reading that. Yeah, it's a really wonderful question. Your first comment was about sort of the language we use, and I get that question all the time. Well, what do you mean by value? And I fully admit that, as Whitehead would say too, there's no perfect dictionary, right? We experience far more always than our language can express. So value is an attempt to express a certain qualitative nature to our experience. But you're right. The language of value presumably includes everything from utility all the way up to truth, beauty, and goodness, and whatever combination they afford. But people ask me, what should we be up to in the universe? And sometimes I like to respond by saying, well, what we should be up to in the universe is what the universe is up to in you. And this is that sort of evolutionary arc I think that you are pointing to. And I do think that both of us are helped by Whitehead here. In Griffin, I'd remind us, who says that evolution seems to be about this haunting for intrinsic states of worth, this deeper capacity to experience states of intrinsic worth. So whatever one's thoughts about evolution, this has been part of it. We see it manifest within us. And when we think about where evolution could go, I might not be as confident as some of the Teilhardians, the omega point, but nevertheless, there is this lure, to use that term again, to be more than we presently are, and to be more than we presently are in a positive direction. And so I think value becomes the compass, the arc in which I think about evolution too. So, I mean, does that help? I struggle
Absolutely.
with you.
Yeah, no, that's great.
To express
we'll have
that.
to talk about this some more sometime. Yeah, that'd be great.
I hope we do so. Yeah.
Okay, good. I look forward to it.
Thank you, Steve.